This is a story of The Other Wise Men by Henry Van Dyke. It was written 100 years ago. Henry Van Dyke said he had a dream about it, and he believes maybe it might be true. Well, as we all know, there were 3 wise men. But there was one more that we haven't heard about, and that's Artibus. Artibus lived in a big castle, and the 3 wise men came and visited him, and they went to the highest floor on his roof and was watching the stars when they seen a huge star in the sky. Well, they decided they were going to follow it, but Artibus, he needed to get ready to travel, but the other 3 wise men, they were ready to go. They had their gold and myrrh and incense. But they said, you come to the castle at Mount Orantus and be there by Friday at midnight, and you can go with us. Well, Artibus hurried off to the market, and he sold his castle, and he sold all his possessions. And he bought 1 big red ruby and 1 blue sapphire and 1 pearl. And those would be his gifts for Jesus. So he also got traveling equipment. He got a camel and a backpack so that he could travel. It's going to be a long journey across the desert. Well, Artibus hurried off to catch up with the other 3 wise men. And he wasn't very far from the castle when he heard this moaning and then he thought, was that an animal or something? And he kept on going, and then he heard it again, and he thought it sounded like a man. So he hopped off his camel and went to check, and the man was sick. And Artibus, he was also a magi, and he kind of a doctor, so he tried to help him, but he knew needed more care. But if he took care of him, he wouldn't be able to catch up with the wise men. So Artibus took him back to the village and asked the innkeeper if he would watch over him and take care of him and feed him medicine. And he gave him the blue sapphire. So Artibus was off to try to catch up with the wise men. But when he got to the castle, they were gone. And Artibus decided, well, he'd take off on his own, but he'd wait till dark. And sure enough, the star came out, so he followed the star. And when he approached Bethlehem, he asked if anybody had seen the 3 wise men. Oh, sure, but they've gone. Then he asked, well, what about the baby Jesus? And they said, well, we've heard that he might have left for Egypt. So he knocked on a door and asked this man and woman if they'd let him stay for the night, and they said they would, and they had a little baby that cried. But they said that the Roman soldiers were going to kill any of the babies. Well, that night the Roman soldiers came to their house and knocked on the door and says, open up in the name of King Herod. And Artibus went to the door, and he had his red ruby, and he says, the only ones here is me and the man and the woman. And he handed the soldier the red ruby, and they took it and left. And he heard the Roman soldiers say, there's no babies here. Well, Artibus didn't know what to do. He wanted to see the baby Jesus. So he kept looking, and for years and years, and his hair turned gray, and finally it was about 33 years later, and he went into the gates of Jerusalem. And right there, he seen a young girl. She must have been about 11 years old. She was being sold as a slave, and she was crying, and he looked at her, and he just couldn't stand it. He went to the man and said, what do I need to purchase this girl? And he says, you don't have enough to purchase this girl. And Artibus handed him the pearl. And so the guy said, well, you can have her then. And Artibus says, the girl told him that she's heard that the Savior has come to Jerusalem. And then they heard a commotion, and they went to the front of the crowd, and there was Jesus carrying the cross. And at that moment, Jesus looked at Artemis, and Artemis looked at him, and Jesus said to him, "Well done, well done." So that's the story of Artemis, the fourth wise man, and why we never heard about him. Because he was too busy helping people. He didn't go to the manger when Jesus was a baby.